Apolline Lamar stole the precious few minutes she had to retreat to the privacy of her hotel room. She was not much of a drinker, but she mixed herself a cocktail anyway, a strong one, and then she sat on the bed, trying to collect herself. Speaking in front of cameras and large audiences was not something that normally rattled her. There were always some nerves, of course, but not like this. She was a doctor, a scientist, an expert on cetaceans specifically, yet during her years working with Dr. Hugo Durand, she'd fallen into the role of spokesperson and public relations face for the work they shared. Hugo was a natural star, charismatic, witty, and movie star handsome, but he could also be biting, a little too impatient with questions he found tiresome, and a little too quick to make a savage retort. So he leaned on Apolline, naturally calm and even-tempered, even though she was a hands-on researcher just as much as he was, and so much more than a PR manager. But she took on the role without hesitation. It was simply what needed to be done for the work. Above all was the work. Apolline had been Hugo's protégé, then his indispensable partner, and they became friends, but it was not always easy sailing. When they first met, she committed a terrible faux pas, telling Hugo he was like the Jacques Cousteau of the 21st century. She hadn't known how he hated that comparison, considering it a lazy, cheap throwaway line that was attached to him only because he and Cousteau were both Frenchmen who worked in the ocean. But the two of them got through that initial awkwardness, because Hugo could see in young Apolline the same passion for discovery and conservation that fueled his own restless heart. And now, so many years on, here Apolline was, in Geneva, where the Environmental Protection Treaty that Hugo long dreamed of was about to become an international reality. She was sure that the whales, if they only knew, would thank Hugo now, just as Apolline did. Most new species are discovered quietly. Scientists might doggedly search for years through mountains, rainforest, or desert, armed only with folklore and a single fuzzy photograph, all in search of some owl or bush baby, before proudly declaring their find. Only then does the public see the bright, full-color photos, hear the exotic new scientific names, and realize the wisdom in local legend. But it was not like this for the largest animal we now believe to ever exist on the earth. It was chance that a deep-sea eruption happened in their preferred habitat at the peak of their social season, and this event forced a great multitude of them to the surface all at once, like something between a pod and a caravan extending for 100 miles. And also it was by chance alone that a convoy of American naval vessels happened to pass that way at that precise time, and were able to capture the breaching of these majestic animals, the mega whale, Balaenoptera leviathan, via still photos and live camera footage. There was no possibility of it being a hoax. It was not only the most explosive discovery of a new species ever recorded, but it was also, without question, one of the most magnificent displays of nature's power ever observed by man. Morphologically, the Leviathan whale resembles the blue whale, its closest relative, but is many times larger. Its hide is a deep ruby red color, nearly black, that makes it virtually invisible to the other great creatures, both known and unknown, that inhabit its ultra-deep-sea world. These creatures travel the globe, but prefer the cold southern oceans, and generally keep to areas where shipping is light. Though if this is due to our activity or not, we can only guess. Calves stay with their mothers for years, and it seems that parents and offspring communicate via their whale song all their lives, though this behavior is not yet well understood. The Balaenoptera leviathan is generally solitary, but they congregate on predictable cycles for mating and for social reasons that we do not yet fully grasp. We still have no concept at all of how long they live. We do know that they can subsist for ages on near-starvation diets, as their blubber stores and high internal volume create an extremely efficient metabolic system. Their massive lung capacity allows them to dive deeper than any other marine mammal into the world of total darkness, so that when they do feed, it's off of massive clouds of tiny organisms, and they can remain in this food-rich abyss for long periods. We know one stroke of their massive flukes can propel them, in near silence and with minimal effort, for hundreds of kilometers at almost no metabolic cost, and we know that their massive size, combined with their thick blubber wall, makes them virtually impenetrable to predation, even as babies. Ironically, it was their size that helped to shield them from detection. Being so large and moving through massive clouds of microprey, they must have appeared as shrimp clusters on sonar, clouds numbering in the millions or even billions. We think now that they were probably detected many times, but dismissed as shifting underwater ridges or other known phenomena. And if anyone ever saw one visually, they would likely have thought it a blue whale, with the apparent scale perhaps being an illusion, as size and distance can be difficult to gauge in open waters or from the air, and especially in the dead of night, their preferred time to breathe, when their coloration would be less apparent. Most of what we know of Balaenoptera leviathan is owed entirely to Hugo Durand. His initial speculations about the super whales were correct, allowing him to be the first scientist to hunt a group of them down after that explosive first sighting. Durand invested everything he had into an all-new form of tracking beacon, knowing that creatures with such thick hides would be impervious to traditional equipment like skin-piercing darts. His new darts were in fact massive ultra-powerful suction cups attached to the whale's dorsal ridge, harmless and scarcely noticeable to the animal, but near impossible to dislodge. These tags record the whale's deep-frequency infrasound song, which travels for thousands of miles, trapped and carried along by the immense water pressure and extreme temperatures at those depths. Of course, this left the problem of how to attach the tags, as predicting when the creatures would surface to breathe was impossible. Durand solved for this too, rallying investors from around the globe and resulting in La Costaguana, a unique ultra-deep-sea submersible equipped with cameras, sensors, and specialized arms for interacting with the environment. And it was Durand himself who became the Costa's pilot, diving into the depths deeper than most had ever gone or would ever go, and attaching the tracking tags to some 24 Balaenoptera leviathan himself, all at tremendous risk, but he wouldn't have had it any other way. There were many close calls over the years. The closest they'd ever come to losing the Costa and Hugo had been a decade before the speech in Geneva. That day's dive was intended to be purely an exhibition of the sub's enhanced capabilities, and the press had been invited to observe and ask questions. It was just off the coast of Nice, where they had their main base of operations, and where so many tests of the sub took place. But on the way down, a 6-gill shark collided into the coaster hard, and then tried to take a few bites out of the hull, damaging some of the sensitive external equipment that helped the crew track Hugo's location. The shark left, seeming annoyed, but it took them more than an hour to get Hugo back up, and Apolline, though not a machine specialist, knew all along the peril that Hugo was in. She'd only ever seen him emerge from the sub with a smile. He'd wave at the crowd, no matter how small, and as he walked over, he'd unzip his wetsuit enough to show just a little too much skin. He always enjoyed pushing the envelope like that. "It's the Frenchman in me," he'd said to her before. "You're Quebecois, you wouldn't understand." And he'd wink that naughty wink that made her laugh but also cringe a little, knowing the questions it would elicit from the press if they saw it. Because once they had their initial questions out of the way, about what went wrong with the dive, and was Hugo okay, and when would the coaster be ready to try again, there was this one damn question they'd always ask. Were Hugo and Apolline together? Or rather, when would they finally admit that they were? Hugo had, initially, tried to parry these inquiries with humor, essentially saying that there was no denying that Apolline was beautiful, which was kind of him to say, but that her pretty face was more than outshined by her expertise and professionalism. This approach was, however, completely ineffective, and in time, it seemed to Apolline, Hugo came to resent the question as much as she did. Almost. It absolutely infuriated her. She'd come to work with Hugo almost immediately after graduate school, and she'd been selected on the basis of her accomplishments. It wasn't as if she'd sent in a headshot or a centerfold. Hugo had told her he had no idea what she looked like when she was chosen, because her appearance was irrelevant. And while she'd known what Hugo looked like, having seen him online and on television, and she knew he was very handsome, his looks were the last thing on her mind. She was there to work in the ocean, to save it, to save the whales and all the cetaceans. She wanted to work with the leading scientists of her day to rescue the life of the sea. That was her passion. That was all that mattered, not some tabloid fantasy. But it was likely because of how they looked, and the juice that could be squeezed from this rotten fruit of have they, haven't they, that they became the media sensation they were, followed by cameras invited on talk shows, with crowds of cameras at their press conferences and demonstrations. And all of that was good for the work. The discovery of the Leviathan whale was something no one could have predicted. Indeed, many speculative biologists would have said with confidence that such a creature was impossible. And that was entirely the point. If something this majestic could go unnoticed by man for all his history, then what else awaited discovery in the deep? What else might there be in danger of us destroying it even before we found it, that could help us feed millions, or cure disease, or resolve pollution, or help us better understand our place in the cycle of life? This was the core of Hugo's mission and Apolline's. They would save the ocean by making the Leviathan whale the symbol of its mysteries and the unexpected wonders awaiting within, if we could be convinced not to destroy ourselves first. And there were moments when they felt they were making such good progress, when observations about the whales brought forth fascinating new conjectures about their habits or life cycle, calling the world to their headquarters at Nice, and conversation would briefly turn to that all-important question: if these creatures could escape our notice, then what else has? But so quickly, the meaningful discussion would descend once more into gossip and dramatics. "Mademoiselle, it was rumored that you and Hugo shared a room during your visit to Greece. Is it true?" And how was one to answer? Should one defend one's privacy and principles through silence, allowing the rumor to persist? Or should one quash it with the truth by opening the drawbridge and pretending that truth was anyone else's business? Hugo chose to laugh and sometimes to bite, but she had chosen to answer directly. No, they were not involved. No, they had not shared a room, and she rather doubted that anyone had said they had. No, she rather suspected that the story had been invented in that moment to sex up what the reporter thought was too dry of a story about ecological matters. A flushed and visibly angry reaction which, admittedly, only made the rumor an even bigger part of the article that resulted. And this was really the only recurring source of argument between Apolline and Hugo. He agreed it was wrong, that these speculations would never happen if they were two men or two women, and the intrusion might be less persistent, more implication than accusation, were their ages reversed, or closer to being the same. But ultimately he thought, what does it matter? Let the gossips gossip. It had no impact on the truth, and should have no impact on them, he said. Not when there was such important work to be done. But that was easy for him to say, wasn't it? He was the man, and he was the senior partner. No one questioned his credentials. No one ever suggested that Hugo Durand became a world-class marine biologist because he was so easy to look at. But Hugo could not say the same about Apolline, and when Apolline pointed this out, he relented. It was one of the few times she left him speechless, because she was right, and he could not argue it, which was not a position he was used to. Then came the day that changed everything. They were at their second little headquarters, the one in New Caledonia in the South Pacific, which Hugo had essentially been renting from an old colleague of his. Apolline had always liked it out there. Hugo did too. It was much quieter than Nice, and the people around them seemed genuinely interested in the work, and disengaged from, if not oblivious to, the tabloid angle. A tugboat pulled La Costaguana out into the open seas, to a place where Hugo knew from his long-term tracking that the whales convened. It had already been established by then, thanks to several years of tracking, that the Balænoptera leviathan had regional hubs where they would congregate on a predictable cycle, after a gradual build-up of their song. Family groups would reunite, swimming and playing together. Mating rituals would occur. It was almost like the whales had a holiday, a regular observance, with its according rituals and expectations. And Hugo was determined this time to observe it firsthand. Apolline and the crew would remain above, on the tug and two small backup boats, monitoring, recording, and prepared to intervene in an emergency. The descent went smoothly. The Costa was a tough little machine, and Hugo had become an adept pilot. As always, the cameras were rolling. It was a long way down to the lowest reaches of what they call the Midnight Zone, the place where the leviathans and krakens of legend turned out to be real, and where creatures that defied imagination and comprehension alike were still regularly spotted, some only once. The pressure grew, but the Costa slid through it like a hot knife through butter, protecting always its eager occupant, whose words, excited as those of a child on Christmas, bubbled continually up to the surface, describing everything he saw. At last he came to the giant's playground, with the Costa's red spotlight tracing their movements in the dark. The whales were like living mountains, and once more Hugo was struck by how deserving they were of their biblical naming. The sight of a blue whale was often enough to bring a first-time observer to tears, overwhelmed by the scale and sheer majesty of those creatures. But this was on another level. Mothers like cruise ships alongside their calves as big as yachts. Whole family groups gliding along together, their bodies touching. And the overwhelming song, the song of these creatures, was deep, slow, felt more than heard. But here, where their cries overlapped and echoed and re-echoed, they took on an altogether different character. It was more like a chorus, a continuous expression of joy. Hugo's laughter carried up to the crew above, and Apolline smiled, tears in her eyes, for knowing Hugo so well. Hugo, who could at times be macho and stoic. She knew how moved he was, how overwhelmed. She could hear it in his voice, even if others could not. This was the culmination of everything he had ever dreamed, and in this moment he was incapable of hiding it, and didn't care. And she was so happy for him. This was when it happened. He had moved smoothly through the gathering, but then, on the outskirts, he found a pregnant cow, his curiosity turning to panic as he noted its distress. Of course, no Balaenoptera leviathan had ever been observed giving birth up to this point, but their appearance, anatomy, and behavior was similar enough to the blue whale for the situation to be obvious to Hugo. The mother was bleeding. The calf's head was still within the mother, which was good, as this meant it was still receiving air. But it had not come cleanly tail first through the birth canal as a new calf should. Its tail was still partially snagged inside the mother's body, preventing the calf from exiting, and putting both cow and calf in imminent danger. The joyful spark left Hugo's voice at once as he described the situation to the crew above and pointed the Costa directly toward the mother and calf. He knew the danger, and didn't need a lecture from Apolline or anyone else, not that he would have listened. He spoke calmly, like a physician, as he swam alongside the panicked, failing mother, using a suction device on the Costa to attach himself to her underside. She bucked, understandably, but Hugo was able to keep himself with her. Then, gingerly, as carefully as he could, he used the two mechanical arms of the Costa to try to reposition the infant. It was flailing, weak but alive. Hugo called it the little thing, even though it was many times larger than the Costa, let alone himself. He was too small to simply move the baby around, but he could push. So he pushed inward and downward toward the baby's head, releasing the pressure on the tail. And after several tense moments, the tail kicked free. Almost at once the mother began to swim upward, and Hugo knew why. She'd come down to the depths to join the congregation, but perhaps the birth had come on suddenly, before she'd expected it. Now, with her baby moments from its first independent breath, she had to climb, to get as close to the surface as possible, so the baby she'd fought so hard for would not drown. Hugo released his grip on her at once, and then began to climb with her. For about a minute, the Costa was approximately level with one of her eyes, her massive, expressive eye. And one mustn't forget that whales, being mammals, have largely the same emotional palate that all mammals do, including us. And it seemed to everyone in that moment that the mother understood what Hugo had done, and that she was grateful. The mother reached the surface in time. Her calf was born, and she nudged him to the surface where he breathed. Surprisingly, mother and son remained at the surface for some time, and it was the best opportunity the world ever had up to that point to photograph the Balaenoptera leviathan in daylight. They were magnificent, their proximity to the tugboat and assistant ships emphasizing their titanic scale. It became a watershed moment in the story of the whales, the sight of mother and son swimming together, touching. a parent showing the world to her new child, a tale as old as life, something anyone can understand. It would change everything. But Hugo Durand would never see it. The coaster was tough, but something went catastrophically wrong during the rapid ascent. Somewhere, while approaching the sunlit zone, the craft came apart. It happened very suddenly. One moment, Hugo was laughing and saying to Apolline, "Hey, mermaid, can you see the mother yet?" And the next, he was gone. Apolline wanted to run away after that. They all did, everyone on Hugo's crew. And some of them, the more anonymous ones, would get their chance, although their passion for the work would end up drawing them all back eventually. For Apolline, though, there could be no escape, because, like it or not, she was the face of the work. And now that news had broken about Hugo, she was the one who would have to face the cameras and speak on it. There were, of course, many kind things said about him. Every question directed to Apolline began with a preamble about Hugo's brilliance, his courage, and sometimes his charm as well. There were many expressions of hope that the work would continue despite the tragedy, and Apolline assured them all that yes, it would. And she was grateful that many people expressed their hope that she herself would take over leadership of Hugo's efforts. And while she let these comments go by with a smile and thanks, she too knew in her heart that it could be no other way, and that it was what Hugo would want. Yet old habits die hard. Even here, in the midst of her grief, the questions would sometimes have a personal twist. This must be especially difficult for you, Dr. Lamar, considering your personal closeness with Dr. Durand? And she would think to herself, you lousy pricks, even now you're still trying to sell that same damn story. The sweet part of what came after was that it was entirely the result of not just Hugo's bravery that day, but also his boundless empathy and compassion. By saving the mother and calf, and giving the entire world the spectacle of that miracle birth, he ignited a firestorm of awareness and change that whole generations of environmental scientists had fought for and dreamed of, but never seen. The bitter part, of course, was that he did not get to see it either. Yet this also only added to the tale, by making him the tragic hero, willing to risk it all for the greater good. Hugo was no longer just the new Jacques Cousteau. He became the saint of the ocean. Few things move swiftly in law or government, but when the world looked at the Balaenoptera Leviathan mother and child in the full light of day, a Rubicon was crossed. The world did not change overnight, but it was also the case that the protection of these creatures was simply demanded. They could not be protected in isolation, however. Only the preservation of the sea could ensure it. And this was why Dr. Apolline Lamar, president of the Hugo Durand Institute for Marine Science, found herself in that luxury hotel in Geneva. In an hour's time, she would be a guest of the United Nations, and would hear many men and women speak eloquently about science, about the seas, and the whales, and Hugo too. And then she herself would speak, to thank the delegates for the ratification of DAOR, the Durand Accord on Ocean Resilience, by far the most ambitious convention of its kind. It aimed to reduce pollution, fight climate change, cut back on overfishing, and protect not only Balaenoptera Leviathan, but all life, both known and unknown, that made the sea its home. And then, soon enough, Apolline knew she would once again face the press, hear the effusive praise for Hugo, receive much commendation for herself and for the team she now led, be asked what the accord will mean for the world, And what should come next? And she knew she would also be asked, as she always was, about Hugo and how close they really were and what they really meant to each other, because it was simply impossible for some people to believe that a man and a woman could be close and share a passionate mission without sharing a bed. But as Apolline stood in front of the mirror, she couldn't help but smile. Pinned to her dress was a beautiful brooch, one of her treasures, in fact. A platinum frame in the shape of a mermaid, with a tail full of aquamarines in different sizes, hair of rubies and garnets, and the form of the human woman in diamonds. She touched it, tears in her eyes even as she smiled at her memory of that night, about a week before the accident, when Hugo gave it to her. She'd been shocked. She wasn't sure how to take the gesture. There was no card, of course. Hugo hated that sort of thing. He just handed her the box from the jeweler as if it was a bag of potato chips, and then poured himself a drink casually as she opened it, her surprise and confusion left unaddressed for her to sit with until she could manage a question. "What's this for?" she asked, staring at it. "You don't like it?" he said, still grinning. She lifted it out of the box. It was about the size of a sand dollar, incredibly intricate, astoundingly beautiful. "Of course I like it," she said. "It's incredible, but—" "But what?" he asked, taking a drink. She looked at him for a long time, grinning, thinking, but not speaking. Finally she asked, "Hugo, do you love me?" And the coyness, the game, completely left her face. It left his too. His cocksure grin vanished. He crossed to her, sitting next to her on the sofa. "You're my mermaid," he whispered. He swallowed, and his voice cracked when he said, "The work, it's—" Then he sighed. "I've always loved you. Don't you know that?" She took him in her arms and kissed him. It was the first time. It was not the last, though they wouldn't have long. When they finally parted, she looked at him, stroking the side of his face, marveling at how beautiful he was. And she said quietly, "Yes, Hugo, I know. I always have."